a prophecy. And the prophecy sometimes we refer to as the 70 weeks. And that was right where we had stopped last time. And I just want to talk about this, say for the next 20 minutes, the prophecy of 70 weeks. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy. Here's this profound and remarkable prophecy that the statement is made here about what's coming. Now, what was the time period that Daniel had started this chapter reading about? Do you remember?
536.
Well, that's all right. That's very good. That's actually the time that this happened. He just read about a length of time, though, that had been prophesied by Jeremiah. Now, what was that? 70 years. So he just read about 70 years. And now the prophet says, now there's 70 weeks. Now, that's kind of interesting. There had been 70 years. Now there's 70 weeks. Now there's 70 weeks. Now, 70 weeks. I'm going to tell you that I spent a lot of time in the last few weeks, and I even roped in Stephen James to help me out. And let me say, I feel less confident than I did when I started in talking about the 70 weeks and what we're talking about. But the big question about 70 weeks is, what is 70 weeks meant to measure? What's the most common way we try to understand 70 weeks? Anybody want to throw it out there? Stephen, go ahead.
Oh, we think of 7 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if you look in the words in the Hebrew, it actually is sabbath, sevens.
Yeah, 77. Yeah.
Sevens.
Yeah.
And if you look to Leviticus 25, verse 5, at the end of verse 5, it's talks about sabbatical years. So that could be what it's saying. The 77s could be the 7 sabbatical years.
Yeah. And it's kind of tricky because even the 70 years before were 70 Sabbath years that had been owed, they had owed God 70 Sabbath years. Now, by the way, what is Brian's golden rule about numbers in the Bible? That they probably don't mean what we think they mean. And here's what's tricky. Even when they are really simple, they're not necessarily simple. I was reading somebody who said, reading one commentator trying to explain the 70 weeks, and he said, even the 70 years wasn't exactly 70 years. It was, it was roughly 70 years. And, and I think about the idea of a lot of times when the Bible counts things up and we're kind of confused, if you've ever tried to count up the captivity or you try to count up the years of the Israelites during the period of the Judges, you really struggle. And the reason is, they don't count like we would. We don't appreciate the idea that counting isn't necessarily, counting is cultural sometimes, from the very simple idea of, do you begin with 0 or 1? And why does that matter? Well, they didn't have 0 back then. So, they didn't count the way we count. So it's kind of tough to appreciate and understand sometimes what we're talking about. But the question we usually say is, 70 weeks, what do we typically say that's a representation of? Barry? You're going to say, oh, you had that look, Barry. I thought you knew the answer.
I don't
Yeah. All right. I'm pointing, people. What do we say? We say 70 weeks may represent, Ryan?
The captivity.
Well, the captivity period was 70 years, so that's interesting how those two seem to transition.
1 week for every 7 years.
Okay, so a week for every 7 years. And how many years does that come up to? Do some math. That comes up to 70 sets of 70, or about 490 years.
Yep.
Most commentators, go ahead.
But what we're talking about here is this idea of the timeline and events that are happening versus a perfect matching.
Yeah.
And that's where we get in trouble.
You're jumping ahead, Barry. Barry, you are a jump ahead guy. I like it, Barry, because you're thinking that way. But what Barry is leading us to say is, it's not going to fit perfectly when we try to say, let's line this up. And that leaves us to decide, is it meant to fit loosely or is it meant to just be symbolic? And that's actually kind of the trick we have here trying to understand this. He says 70 weeks, and so we think, well, could that be 490 years? There's nothing specific in the Bible that says, and 1 week is 7 years. But generally speaking, we think, well, It's kind of like the 40 days that the spies, this one person made the point to say 40 days that the spies were in Israel or in Canaan is 40 years of their being wandering in the wilderness, a connection to that. Maybe, they try to make that point to tie those things. Maybe that's it. And it could be that that's what we're meant to see. Anthony?
Also, mean the 70 weeks or like one week is every 7 years. So that could be the time between after the temple is and the temple is restored until the Messiah comes.
So specifically, Anthony, let's jump over there for a second, because I think what you're referencing is here in verse 25. And he says that from the going forth of the command to restore, is that what you were thinking? The command to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, here's what's kind of tricky about that. The command to build and restore Jerusalem, well, that's, who's giving that, who's the one that's most often associated with that command? It's Cyrus. He's the one that makes the initial statement that they're to go back and to restore. You see that in Ezra chapter 1. You see that in 2 Chronicles. And that's in the year, and Barry knew it, around 536, 535 BC. Well, 490 years from that time period, Barry's shaking his head. Why, Barry?
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't really give us a good time. Now, a lot of people say, well, wait a second. The command to restore might be this statement that's made in Ezra chapter 7, when much later a king reissued a command. King Artaxerxes said, I want you to go back and to do a full restoration of Jerusalem. We could say the walls of Jerusalem. Remember Nehemiah building up the walls. And so if we pick that time period, well, watch what happens. So if we pick that time period, and we actually have a pretty good time frame, not great, pretty good time frame, 490 years, that puts us, well, around the year 30 AD. And we think, boy, that's nice. That fits really nice. So at first, it might seem like, and a lot of times I've even talked about this from the perspective of, wow, what a great timing that this gives us. The more I think about it, the more I think maybe it's not meant to be something that we can count right up to. For one thing, there doesn't seem to be evidence that in the time of Jesus, they were necessarily saying, well, we're doing the countdown from this time period. They may not have, for one thing, they may not having a system of calendar that measured years like we do. They may not have known how many years were passing, so to speak, but they may also not have had a sense of, the idea of when the Messiah was going to come specifically. So it's not clear that they knew too much, but they knew in general that he was about to come, but not something specific. So it's not clear if they understood this. But the other thing is, when we look at what the 70 weeks were meant to bring about, and at first when we read this in verse 24, he talks about, the end of, finished transgression, end of sin, reconciliation, everlasting righteousness, the anointing of the Holy One. But he also goes on to give us a list of some other things too. The end of sacrifices, destruction of the city and the sanctuary. And finally, he talks about the abomination of desolation there in verse 27. Well, a little bit of a problem because those last couple of things, when did they happen? Yeah, 40 years after this. So it's kind of tough. Now, I will, because I'm the kind of person that, I can be very political, I will say whatever you think, In other words, if you're looking at this and you see a pretty specific time period, it's hard for me not to see a time that runs right up to Jesus, that Daniel's being told, this is how long you have to wait, and he can kind of gauge that. Well, I like that. But I also struggle to pin it down perfectly, and so I'm willing to accept also that 70 weeks is also very likely a response to the 70 years of captivity. So he says, you now have 70 weeks until the total restoration or the total repair of the relationship with God, the promises, for example, that Jeremiah talked about in Jeremiah 31 in the New Covenant. And of course, these promises of destruction as well. Barry?
Could it not be that the 70 weeks is representing the actual answer to the prayer of hope and not a time, not a number of times?
What would be an indication of that, Barry?
Well, you just read it. You
Yeah.
just read the 6 things that the message of hope is going to provide, and it just seems that it's talking about the Messiah, but it does, you can't add up the numbers to try to get there.
Yeah, especially since we're not talking about all these things happening at once, right? That they happened over a 40-year period. Well, Barry, another thing I think about is the number 70. What do we know about that number?
Complete.
It's a very symbolic number, Teresa.
Yeah, I was gonna say 7, and there's other numbers throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, that are kind of symbolic.
Yeah.
So could it just not mean a period of time or
Yeah.
fulfillment of
Yeah.
time?
It very well could be. And like I said, after a couple of weeks of trying to dig onto this, the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking maybe we're just looking at something that's symbolic. Maybe it's just meant to say, another period of time is going to come, 70 weeks, like the 70 years of captivity, the 70 weeks of waiting for Messiah to come, and then everything's going to be fulfilled. Stephen?
I think we're overlooking something, or maybe reading something that we don't, not necessarily putting together. In verse 25, it's talking about the Messiah of the Prince. There'll be 77s, 7 sevens and 62 sevens, and it will be built again with Plaza mode in time of distress. So that's the 69 weeks. Then you go to verse 27. It talks about.
It talks about
and he will make a firm covenant.
the 1 week.
So
Yeah.
This is very distinctly referring to 7 years.
Yeah.
It says here, and he will make a firm covenant, new covenant, with the many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, 3.5 years, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, which happens to the crucifixion, when the temple curtain is rent in two. And on the wings of, and then it says on the wings of abomination. So basically we're saying this is the final week.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Whatever follows after that is the destruction that is prophesied after.
Which is interesting because, he breaks it down to another period of time. And, if we want to count it as years, and like I said, maybe we're better off just going back to just as the weeks. But the point is, in that last week, a lot of things were going to happen. One of them was the end of sacrifices. The other one was the end of Jerusalem.
No.
Well,
I mean,
what he says is on the wing of abomination, we typically point to that abomination of desolation as the prophecy that Jesus has in Matthew 24.
What I'm saying is that verse 27 clarifies what that last week really is. And it's talking about the end. He puts an end to the grain offering in his crucifixion, which is the other sacrifices. And then it follows with, what is it? In the middle of the week, put tender sacrifices. And on the wing of the abominations will come. He's just saying that there's this last week, 7 in the last week, which I see it as the opening of the church in Pentecost. So Christ is sacrificed 3.5 years into his ministry, 3.5 more years or so, but the church is open, the new covenant to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And the abominations, or all of the destruction, is an entirely separate 49 years if you take it 80-30 to 80-79. 80-70 for the Jews and 80-79 for the destruction of Rome.
Well, and I want to be careful about that 79 AD. That's just a speculation. That's not a biblical idea you've got there. But let's to step back to say that the difficulty is he says that last week, in the middle of it, the end of end of our worship, but at the end of it, at the wing of it, is the abomination of desolation. So that's the dilemma you run into, is to say, well, it doesn't quite fit to the 3.5 years. I like it because 3.5 years, that's how long Jesus preached. Well, maybe. We don't know that, but that's kind of a guess. But, the truth is, it fits nicely. But again, this is the problem with being trying to pull the numbers out too specifically. We always bump into something that's kind of hard to reconcile. And in this case, that abomination of desolation is the thing. And let's let me jump back there and let's just answer this question real quickly to do that. The abomination of desolation that is mentioned here, where else is it mentioned, Teresa?
In Mark 13:14 and Matthew 20:14.
Yeah. And in both of those contexts, Teresa, do you remember what the context of the conversation was?
Well, the apostles were asking him questions about what the end was.
Yeah, the end of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, by the way, we haven't got there yet, but Luke is a great person to help us understand this, because when Luke brings up the abomination of desolation, he says it's when Jerusalem, everybody know? When Jerusalem is surrounded by, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you're gonna say surrounded by armies.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
doesn't use the
That's right.
abomination of desolation.
that's right. He just
Very
calls it a
correct.
desolation, an abominable desolation that's surrounded to armies. You know, he just uses some of the language to give us a sense of, oh, that's what he really means by that. So it really is interesting. So, so it's a good point. Stephen, second question there, the middle of the week, and the question was, you know, the end of sacrifices, but what's that mean? What is that?
Christ put an end to sacrifices. The
So,
temple was rent.
Yeah.
There was an earthquake, destroyed the temple, destroyed much of the temple. They had no ability to continue sacrifices after the new covenant.
so with all this being said, you know, it's kind of, you know, it's intriguing to what degree we could pin this down. It's exciting. I love it. But in the end, it's God telling Daniel, you've just finished 70 years. Now you've got another period of time you're going to wait. And some other things are going to happen. And by the way, that's tonight and next week as we finish up. These last few chapters are talking about these events that happen, you know, that they're meant to be thinking about, that fill in that time, so to speak, up to the time of Jesus. But he says, this is what's going to happen. This is how God's plan is. There were 70 years, but now there's going to be 70 weeks. And that 70 weeks is going to bring you up to the promises that I have made. Daniel's had these promises for a long time. When did he first hear about the promise of the kingdom? Yeah, he was just a young man back then. This is maybe it's been 50, 60, 70 years since, since he heard those promises initially. Those 70 years have come to an end, and now he's being told there's another period of time coming. Now, here's a tough question for you. The real emphasis of the prophets to know when Jesus would arrive is less about being able to count it out and more about looking for someone. Now, who does the prophet say that they needed to be looking for that would tell them when the Messiah was actually coming? John the Baptist, which, by the way, that's the last words of the Old Testament. Malachi. Last book of the Old Testament, last words of the last chapter are that it calls him Elijah. Elijah's coming. That's the real sign that they needed to be ready for. Was this next prophet that would come? During all this, there weren't going to be any more prophets, but this next prophet would come. And when he came, that would be how you knew the time had arrived. And so that was the big push on this. So 70 weeks, I don't know. I struggle to understand it well, but I do know that what the point is that there was another time to wait. Daniel would be waiting a little longer, and then the Messiah would come. And all these different things would happen when the Messiah came, including things like, well, we talked about the end of sacrifices and such, but even the destruction of Jerusalem being a big part of that. Any other final comments as we wrap up? Go ahead, Stephen.
The very last part of verse 27 says, and he who makes desolate writing so small here. Even so it says here, and on the wing of abominations will come the one who makes desolate the Roman army, and in particular Titus, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out of the one who makes desolate Rome.
You know what's going to make this really more complicated? In 2 chapters, we're going to come across this abomination of desolation again. And anybody know what it's talking about there? Not a thing of what Stephen said. It's going to be about a Greek ruler instead. And that's going to be really confusing And sometimes when I look at this language of he shall be the one to make desolate, I'm wondering if it's just meant to mirror something else somewhere else. In other words, if we're supposed to be looking at a person or not, a lot more we could talk about that, but it's interesting, but it's going to be really hard because one thing about prophecy is prophecy likes to recycle itself. It likes to take the language and put it somewhere else, and sometimes that makes it easier, and sometimes it makes it a little harder to understand as well. But the point is that when the Messiah came, it was supposed to answer all this, and it did. It did. And when we understand this, even Jesus will point back and say, look, Daniel told you all the things that were going to happen, all that was going to happen. And that's the significance of things like this. Let's go to chapter. Oh, Stephen, last comment, make it quick.
I wasn't tying that to abomination desolation. What I was saying was that there's going to be destruction of Jerusalem, which is very clear. And then it says, and then complete destruction is associated with the one who makes desolate.
Okay.
That was the end of verse 27.
I see what you're saying. Potentially correct. I see what you're saying, and I'll say that typically abomination of desolation is connected as one idea, and you're seeing maybe a difference there. And it could be, and what you're saying is because there's a prophecy back in Daniel chapter 7 of the destruction of Rome. And the only reason that's important, the only reason I would want you to know that is that I would want you to know that at the end of the New Testament, whenever they finished writing, you still have these two prophecies waiting to be fulfilled. The destruction of Jerusalem, they're waiting for that, and the destruction of Rome. And Daniel had prophesied that one too. So it's good to know that when you have a book like Revelation, you can say, this isn't a brand new thing. This was God finishing things he had said he was going to finish. And so it's important that we understand, that way we don't look at Revelation and take it and run off with it to the future. It was fulfilling things that Daniel had talked about. And Daniel had said the destruction of Rome, Daniel chapter 7, destruction of Jerusalem, those were the things God was going to accomplish there. Let's go to chapter 10. Chapter 10. This is Daniel's last vision. Now, why do I call it his last vision? Well, time-wise, it's his last vision. But the next chapter, he's going to mention a vision, and I'll be honest, I'm not entirely clear, in chapter 11 and verse 1, that was several years before this, and I don't know if he's saying, I'm referring back to the vision before, or he's having another vision. And in fact, a lot of our translators aren't sure. They'll put it in brackets, parentheses, either as a parenthetical statement or as a leading into a new prophecy statement. But this seems to be his last vision. His last vision. The third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. This is the last time, time-wise, that Daniel speaks. The last time we hear from him. A message was revealed to Daniel, whose name is called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long. And he understood the message and understood of the vision. Verse 2, in those days I, Daniel, was in mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant food, nor no meat or wine came to my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Now, on the 24th day of the first month, I was beside the side of the great river that is the Tigris. Okay, I want to start off by kind of figuring out what's going on here. And I like that picture, huh? That's the guy that he's describing here. And one thing, by the way, I really hope you're going to be thinking of this image that he's going to describe, because we'll see this image somewhere else, and it's important. It's important, the person we're going to see. So my first question is this. Daniel's condition, specifically it says in verse 2. What's going on with Daniel right now? Grieving, mourning.
He's really weak. He's been fasting.
Yeah, he's not eaten pleasant food, meat, wine in his mouth. He hasn't anointed himself. 3 weeks he's been in this condition. Why?
Well, we know in chapter 9, when he prayed, it was immediately addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's going to run into a different challenge, in that when he prays, there's a delay. And it's terrifying to him in this vision that he's going to see.
Okay,
So it's a delay, and how do you deal with a delay in which a righteous man or a faithful man prays to God, right, like Daniel, and there's a delay. We run into the same thing when we pray. We go, well, what's going on?
Mhm.
You know, why haven't you answered it?
That's a
And
great
so-
analogy.
So you got these two things that are happening from what has happened in the past to what's happening right now.
What, well, kind of picking around this idea, I really like that, Barry, because that's a really neat application for us and how we pray for things and we get really worked up about that. Mourning, though, grieving, that's kind of interesting. What is the time period that's going on right here? I don't mean the 3 years. He specifically tells us when this is.
In the time of Passover.
Yes. Now, what had happened? He says this is the 3rd year of Cyrus. So what has happened in the last couple of years? What did Cyrus do?
He gave them more freedom to
Yeah. He instituted this process that Zerubbabel and Joshua will take, and you're going to have people going back, and so we have all these people going back. This is in the middle of the Passover. This is in the middle of the Passover. Now, what have we said several times about Daniel and his relationship to going to Jerusalem? Go ahead.
Well, he's a eunuch, so therefore he cannot participate
Yeah.
in the festivity or in the worship.
Yeah. I'll be honest, when it just throws out the word grieving, I could think, a lot of things might be going on. Maybe he's anxious about they're going back. Are they going to do it right? I wish I could go with them, but how old am I? Yeah, it's close to 90, yeah. And I don't get to go back and be a part of that too, so that's kind of a tough thing as well. I find this term grieving interesting because I can see a lot of things here, a lot of anxiety, a lot of, worry about what's going to happen. This is a pivotal moment. And, we've talked about this in the past when we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah last year. As this group of people are going back, does this mark a real success of all of Israel saying, hey, we're going to go back, we're all going to go home, we're all going to reinstitute worship, or is it really just a small remnant? Yeah. And it's not this massive, the whole country has turned back to God because, from what we can tell from those taken into captivity and those that choose to go back, it's only a small group that are saying, hey, we'll go back. And that's pretty discouraging.
Seems that that the people have not heard what Daniel has heard, has not seen what Daniel has seen. And it's almost like you go to Revelation 1 when you get the description of Christ. And some people will carry that over here to Daniel, which is incorrect. We'll find out later on in the chapter because someone's going to visit Daniel. But some people will carry that over and say it's the Son of God that he's seeing. But that's not it. It lines up with the same verbiage and stuff, but the context, if we stay in the context, I think we'll understand what he's talking about. But that's
a bold pronouncement. I'll say because typically most people will say, this sounds just like Jesus. This sounds just like the image of Jesus in Revelation chapter 1. So it's interesting, like I said, to say, is it or is it not? It doesn't tell us for sure. So certainly there's some room for debate on that. But it's interesting to put this out there because there's a sense of, who are we looking at here? As he's here, by the way, what did the other men see? Nothing. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Nobody else sees anything. I'm left alone, and when this great vision and no strength returned to me. So what's interesting is he seems to say, I saw this man, and then perhaps he's saying, and the vision left, and then it came back. Daniel's kind of talking out of a sync here, so it's kind of hard for us to exactly put together everything that's being said, especially since in chapter 11, it's not entirely clear if he's restating what he saw before or if he's moved on to an entirely new vision. But his point is, he's in this position, he sees somebody, verse 5 says, and this man that he sees that's described here with the body, the shining body, the shining face, lightning, torches. And who does this sound like? Yeah, in Revelation chapter 1, when John looks up and sees Jesus, and it's not stated right away that it's Jesus, but it's this image that follows a lot of this sounds very, very striking. Go ahead, Stephen.
It's also really interesting in Acts 9, around verse 3, it talks about how Paul saw the vision of the risen Christ, and all the men fell or fled away into the
Yeah.
thing, and he fell off the horse.
That's very interesting. They didn't see it, but what did they? It says they could hear something, but they didn't see anything. Now, what I think is interesting, in verse 9, he talks about, I'm hearing the sound of his words, but what is this? What does the vision of this man do to him? What does it physically do to Daniel?
He's flat on his face.
Knocks him out. Yeah, knocks him down. Verse 9, I heard the sound of his words. While I heard the sound of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face, or with my face to the ground. Now, as he's saying, he'd been in a sleep when it started. It sounds more like he got knocked into a deep sleep. He's been knocked down. Does this remind you what happened when Daniel had this vision earlier, or had a vision earlier, back 2 chapters back? What happened to him when he had the vision a couple of chapters ago? Teresa? Yeah, he was sick, he said, for weeks. We talked about how interesting it is that perhaps these visions had a massive, heavy impact on people and really took some people down. So Daniel is in this position and he's knocked down. He sees this man and it just overwhelms him. And he falls down. And then something happens to comfort him. What is that in verse 10?
He puts his hands and lifts him up, and he's trembling, and he says, "Don't fear."
Yeah. So suddenly a hand touched me. Maybe tremble on my knees, the palms of my hands. He said to me, "Oh, Daniel, man greatly beloved." I like that term because you go back to the last chapter in verse 23. He says, "You're the man that's greatly beloved." Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words I speak to you. Stand upright. I've been sent to you. While he's speaking the word to me, I stood trembling. So, here's somebody else now standing. Maybe it could be the same person that he saw in the vision, but it doesn't have to be that now this person draws him up and says, "Don't fear, Daniel. For from the first day that you set your heart to understand, to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I've come because of your words." Now, I want to pause here for a second. How long has this prophecy or this moment been being worked out?
Sometime 3 weeks.
Well,
he says he's sick for a number of days.
So
but
we saw 3 weeks here. What else do you think? When did Daniel set his heart on God?
When he was very young.
Yeah. So potentially, we're having a conversation that he says, back when you were a boy, when you were that young man in Daniel chapter 1, one of the interesting things about Daniel chapter 1 is Daniel chapter 1 ends with a little footnote that says, this all goes up to. Did you notice that? You notice when it says that it goes up to at the end of Daniel chapter 1? I'll read it real quick. And then you contrast that with chapter 10. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus, till the time of King Cyrus. And here we are with King Cyrus. And so it's kind of interesting to see this connection of these moments. And he says, Daniel, this has been from the time that you humbled yourself before God. Now, by the way, I think Barry's pointing out that it could be verse 2 that he's talking about. I like to think the idea that this perhaps is something that's been going on for decades.
But he doesn't identify himself.
Yeah.
Throughout this whole context.
Yeah. Now, somebody else is going to show up and be identified, aren't they? As he talks about, well, he's going to talk about somebody else here coming in just a moment and give us some identification. But it's interesting that this isn't. In fact, one of the things that a lot of times when these prophets have these visions and meet people, you'll meet more than one person and you're not exactly sure who you're talking to sometimes in that sense.
I think sometimes we're confused. It is a message from God, but it might not be God.
Oh, talking here? Yeah, no, it might not be at all. Even though, like I said, he might have just seen God.
It is his word, and it is a message from him.
Yeah.
Because when we get to chapter 11, he's going to talk about the content of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
When we get to chapter 12, he's going to talk about how you're going to deal with it.
What's kind of neat is that there seems to be a pattern here. And as I said, typically I'll throw the first few verses as being an image of Jesus or an image of God. And then he steps back and has the explanation. Well, that's what happened with Ezekiel, right? When he sees the wheel, he sees the glory of God, then he receives the message. Or even in Revelation, when Jesus appears before John, and then the message comes, and, it's not just Jesus talking, right? It's several times it says, I'm just a servant like you. You might remember that as well. So it seems to follow a pattern where you see this glory, and the glory kind of debilitates you, as it did with Saul. I'm glad you brought up Saul. That's a good example. Saul on the road to Tarsus or such. And then there comes that person who's there to explain things, to talk things through. Now, he starts saying, I'm here because of your words. Now, it gets tough after this. So the next thing he says is, going on, verse 13, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. Oh, I don't know. What do you guys think? This idea of the language of the prince of Persia. I'd throw it at Gus, and Gus would say, well, that was a game that we used to play, the prince of Persia.
This is confusing to me.
Yeah.
But it seems that because he's going to mention Greece too in this context.
That's true. It's coming along, and especially in the next chapter. Yeah.
Next chapter. So you have Cyrus, or you have this king of Persia that's delaying something.
Yeah.
Because he's prayed and it's delayed. It's a contrast between 9 and here. And there's a battle going on here. We deal with a battle all the time. It's a spiritual battle that we deal with. The question is it a spiritual battle that heaven deals with and that we deal with? And that's what the discussion, a lot of people have a discussion on.
Barry, your point is very interesting because it reminds us that sometimes what we're struggling with here is, sometimes people envision this heavenly battle, and, that sometimes even in Revelation. But the true language of spiritual warfare in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says is the battle over what? Anybody remember what Paul talks about when he talks about spiritual warfare, George?
He says our thoughts.
Yeah, bringing our thoughts into subjection and into obedience to God. And it's kind of interesting that when the Bible talks about spiritual warfare, it's not like, as the common thing, two angels are battling each other. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, every time that the Bible does bring Satan to, presenting himself before God, what's that interaction like? Yeah, Satan can only do what God says. He has zero ability to antagonize in that sense for that moment. He is completely under subjection to God. There's no battle in that kind of language. That really fits into that imagery that sometimes people think of. And the important idea to understand is that the battle that goes on, we can even say in heavenly places, we're in heavenly places. And we're battling all the time to bring our thoughts in submission to God. So Barry's comment is good to remind us the idea that we're not talking necessarily about some unusual supernatural battle, but maybe we're talking about something that's just about the prince of Persia not doing things he was supposed to. Well, at this time, the prince of Persia, or the leader of Persia, if it's literally a person, is Cyrus, and Cyrus had some things he was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be delivering God's people. So potentially, we could be talking about that, and about some circumstance of him not wanting to do what he was supposed to do, or some spiritual conflict there. It's kind of hard to say. What else do you think? Who else has a thought on this Prince of Persia? Prince of Persia. Sometimes people wonder if we're talking about maybe some kind of, some negative power or some negative power there. And again, I'm not prepared to throw it out entirely, but I will say it seems pointless to do that. But then he mentioned somebody named Michael. Who is Michael? This is the first time it gets mentioned in Scripture, in fact. Michael. Michael is an angel. We'll meet him again in Zechariah. He'll be talked about there. And then we'll find him in the New Testament as well. The name Michael means who is like God. Kind of an interesting name. And so Michael is described as one in chapter 12. We'll meet him again, and he'll be described as the Prince of Israel. He'll be called the Prince of Israel. Here he's told one of the chief princes, and he came along to help if I'd been left alone there, and now I've come to make known to you the vision that refers to many days. So it's kind of interesting that we have this question and this idea of what's happening here. Let's just understand the idea of Daniel. We've come to bring you some understanding. We've been hindered to some degree. And I even think of like in 2 Thessalonians 2, and it talks about how the son of perdition was being hindered by God in some way before he could do his damage of apostasy. And that's interesting. It could be a comparable statement to something like that. So he picks up here and he says that with all these things, he says, suddenly, verse 16, one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. I opened my mouth and spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision of my sorrows has overwhelmed me, I've restrained no strength. How can this servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? No strength remains. Now it's interesting that verse 18 says they'll come to him, they'll strengthen him, they'll lift him up, and they'll say, verse 19 again, O greatly beloved, fear not, peace with you, be strong. And they strengthen him. Verse 20, they're going to start talking about what's coming. And they say, because we've got a lot of things to talk about. We're not going to talk about them tonight because we're out of time. So I'm going to stop here. But Daniel has some visions to be given of things that are about to start happening, things that are going to come about in the next few years and for the next few centuries, things that answer that question that we always want to answer. What's going on between Malachi and Matthew? Daniel's going to get some visions at that time, but we'll wrap up and stop here. Thanks so much for really good comments and thoughts this evening. Did you pass? And share it.
Grant and I will share them.
Scratch your puzzle.
It's not in that book.
Yeah, probably most people.
It's not in here?
But you guys get the French printer. You get
No, I didn't wear it. Why do you remember I know, the Princess Bride. Every time we say Princess Bride, I'm like, oh, are they gonna do the Sands of Time? I don't think of a video game at all. I think of the movie. I think of Jacob.
Is it my father?
I'm going to make you guys share.
Alright, I don't have this video for you guys, so share. And then I am
I got one more. Who wants it up front? I'll ask and you shall receive. Well, I thought this is a song probably most of you know, and if you're like me, you're kind of surprised it's not in our book. because it's an old one, it's a classic, it's a song I really love. Right out of Isaiah chapter 6, and I enjoy that part, Lord Send Me. Why don't you go ahead and mark your songbooks, your regular songbook, it's song number 325. And that'll be our song of invitation this evening, song number 325. We're going to be singing the song that I've handed out to you, Lord Send Me. Like I said, it's probably a song most of you know. If you've sung songs in the past, years ago, this used to be in the old red Sacred Selections book. So it's got oldie. So we'll sing all 4 verses of this song. There is much to do, there's work on every hand. Hark the cry for help comes ringing through the land. Jesus calls for reapers, I must active be. What wilt thou, O Master? Here am I, send me. Here am I, Lord, send me. Here there's a plaintive cry of mourning soul's distress, and the sigh of hearts who seek but find no rest. Thee should have my love and tender sympathy, ready at thy bidding. Here am I, send me. Here am I, send me. Here am I, send me. There are hungering souls who cry out loud for bread. With the bread of life they're longing to be fed. Shall they starve and famish while a feast is free? I must be more faithful. Here am I, send me. Here am I, there are souls who linger on the brink of woe. Lord, I must not, cannot bear to let them go. Let me go and tell them, brother, turn and flee. Master, I would save them. Here am I, send me. 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 Send me, send me. Here am I, send me. Am I, send me. Ready at thy bidding, Lord, send me.
Good evening. The time that we have, it's interesting going through Daniel and different time periods, ages, and everything like that. And a lot of times I get to thinking about how long things take. When I was younger, I grew up in construction. I loved drafting. I was wanting to be an architect. And then I found out at that time it was 12 years to become an architect. You had 5 years of college and then about 7 years of internship, which is 12 years. And then you had your license, your certifications, all of that stuff to take care of. So I made an executive decision and got married instead. It just took us long. So architecture nowadays, it says 8 to 11. If you want to be an RN nurse, it takes 3 to 4 years. A dentist, about 8 years. A doctor, 10 to 12 years. Surgeon, 13 years. A commercial airplane pilot, 2 years. That one would be good. Engineer, 4 to 5 years, but when you get hired, usually the companies want to send you through their own program because they want you for a specific purpose. So that one's up there in the air a little bit. A teacher, though, is 4 to 5 years as well. Diesel mechanic, 2 to 4 years. And it just keeps continuing. Auto mechanic, about 2 years. So all of these, you take classes and hands-on training, your certificates. But once you get your license, and even some of the hands-on training, you're not really proficient or qualified as somebody that's been doing it for 30 years. And it's something to think about, is how proficient you are. And some of this is attitude, because I've known people that are highly educated I just don't want to be around, because they want basically everything their way. They think they know how it's to be done. They don't think outside the box. They're not creative, and they're just a pain to be around. So, and a lot of this is attitude. And to me, I enjoy talking about attitudes, because attitudes is kind of the flavoring that gets thrown in there. And I want to maybe throw something at you here, that if you have all this knowledge, and with your experience, they call that wisdom. Now, wisdom, if you do something over and over again, you create a habit. So this wisdom plus this habit creates an attitude. So in any given situation, something arises, a problem arises, what are you going to do? What's your attitude towards this? Many times people have the basic attitude of positive and negative, glass half full, glass half empty. Now, if you're a glass half empty kind of person, can you change your attitude to make that half full? According to God, in the Bible, if you look back in Genesis, when he's talking to Cain, after Cain was rejected, his sacrifice was rejected, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." So I'm going to take this as a little bit of a hint that we can change our attitudes. And the way that we change our attitude is basically developing our skills and creating habits. 2 Peter 1, and it's a little bit of a, you're familiar with this one, but it tells us how to develop our skills, and it gives us a guideline. And starting in the second verse, it says, "May grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord." You have knowledge of this. And his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us in his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. For whoever lacks these qualities is so nearsighted that he is blind, having forgotten that he was cleansed from his former sins. Therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election, for if you practice these qualities, you will never fail. For in this way there will be richly provided for you an entrance into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Now, just for a minute, if you would, replace the term qualities with attitude. Now, these attitudes that you have and that you develop over time, they're intermingled with the wisdom and knowledge that you have. And it's kind of like listening to Brian when he gets off into some deep subject. It makes my head hurt because it's all kind of jumbled in. And it's not just one point, but it's many. And you can't just go down the path and say, oh, this is it. This is it. We have to become what it is. We can't become Christians without practice. We had some new baptisms, so we got some new Christian people. They're out there, they're seeking our help. And I encourage them to encourage themselves to seek what God wants. Talk to people, engage yourselves in conversations. Set up classes. I remember when we first came to the Forest Grove class, even though we've been Christians for many years, Jim was adamant you had to have a class. Okay, for one thing, it puts you right in there with people and you start knowing each other. And so you start developing these attitudes. And for us here, two congregations coming together and working on a building project that people are going, okay, what now? There's a fondness that's developed. And all these words, they all jumble together. But to me, it comes down to one thing. And that's being a Christian. Because he's told us what to do. He's told us how we can do it. So now it's up to you. Acts 26:29, Paul, I really like this verse because he was talking to, I forget the king's name now. But he says, I would have all to become as I am, a Christian. Paul had that zeal. Paul had that drive. He had that emotion. He wanted people to know Christ. And so, with that, knowing that we can become something greater than what we are, we can belong, we have a purpose. The basis is right there in front of you. So, if you want to encourage yourself to be baptized, or if you need a helping hand, a thought, a prayer, come up while we sing the song of invitation.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delights. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight.